Thanks so much, everyone, for your patience and hanging on. We were presenting away and didn't realize we weren't streaming, and then figured it out. So thanks for your patience and holding on as we sort ourselves to this new normal way of being. I'd like to welcome you all to the last session in the Faculty of Native Studies Research Colloquium series, which we have entitled Engaging Relations, the entire series. I am Nancy Van Stuyvendale. I am the Associate Dean Research in the Faculty of Native Studies, and it is my great pleasure as part of my role to be able to organize and host the showcase of Faculty of Native Studies Research, which we've had running over the past month. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the faculty is located in Amiskwaciy-Waskahigan, also known as Edmonton, in Treaty 6 territory and the Métis homeland. And this territory is a traditional gathering place for Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, and Inuit. And I'd also like to acknowledge that one of our speakers for today, David Parent, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Native Studies at the University of Manitoba, is located in Winnipeg on Treaty 1 territory, lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and of course, the homeland of the Métis. So today we are delighted to be able to showcase the research of past and present graduate students in our faculty who are specifically engaged in Métis research. And we have today with us Molly Swain, Leah Hrycun, David Parent, and Chelsea Vowel. So a fantastic lineup of speakers for you today. I would like to thank RCMR, the Rupertsland Centre for Métis Research, under the leadership of Dr. Natalie Kermol, who has organized and who will be chairing this panel today. And so without further ado, I will turn it over to Dr. Kermol to say some opening words.
Thank you, Nancy. Hello, my name is Natalie Kermol. I'm a professor in the Faculty of Native Studies and also the director of the Rupertsland Centre for Métis Research. I have to say today for me is a dream come true. I have wanted to do, to organize a panel such as this one for a long time, but we didn't have enough students in order to do that, like who had finished their research. And but now we do, and so it's a fantastic opportunity for RCMR to showcase the fantastic work that our students are doing at the graduate level. So for those of you who don't know what the Rupertsland Centre for Métis Research is, it's a joint venture between the Métis Nation of Alberta, the Rupertsland Institute for Métis Excellence, the Faculty of Native Studies, and the University of Alberta. We are housed in the Faculty of Native Studies at the University of Alberta, and we are mainly an academic research program specifically geared towards Métis issues. In 2021, we will be celebrating our 10-year anniversary, so stay tuned because there's going to be some activities happening starting in January, and people will have the possibility of watching through Zoom some of these activities. The goals and objectives of the Research Center include building provincial and national connections with the Métis community, increasing research capacity to advance Métis-specific research, and training and employing student researchers. And we've organized conferences, we have written reports, we work closely with the Métis Nation of Alberta, with RLI. We also have Métis Talks in the fall and spring, which highlight Métis-specific research, art, and culture. So this specific session is live on Facebook and YouTube. In case of an interruption in the live stream, I was told that you should rest assured there will be a video uploaded after this presentation, and it will be uploaded on the Faculty of Native Studies website, same with RCMR, and also RCMR's webpage. After each talk, we will take questions from the audience. Please ask your questions in the live chat and we will relay them to the presenters. So today we're going to start with Molly Swain. Molly Swain is an Otipimswak Iskweo PhD student in the Faculty of Native Studies at the University of Alberta, studying 20th century Métis political history. She co-hosts Métis in Space, an Indigenous feminist science fiction podcast, and is a member of Freelands, Free Peoples, an anti-colonial penal abolition organization. She is keen on anarchy, solidarity-driven anti-colonial liberation struggles, karaoke, and Star Trek. So today, Molly, the title of her presentation is Transforming Métis Relationships to Labor with and Against the State, Jim Brady's Alberta and Saskatchewan producer cooperatives. So Molly, your turn.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Kamol, and thank you, Dr. Van Stavendale, for those awesome intros. So just a couple notes before I get started. This presentation is actually a little bit different from what I was envisioning. I decided to look at it from a different angle. So I'm going to be talking specifically about the way that the states or the provinces of Alberta and Saskatchewan, their governments undercut Brady's cooperative organizing. I also want to note that while I'm talking specifically about Jim Brady as a leader, his work really needs to be understood as the work of hundreds of people, and it couldn't have happened without the collective participation of Indigenous people across the Northern Prairie provinces. So he is by no means sort of this Ubermensch, great Métis man of history. I mean, he was a great leader, he's very inspirational, but his work and his accomplishments very much are collective. So I'll just get started here, and I'll hit, no, I won't hit the timer. All right, so Jim Brady was an anti-fascist Métis community communist organizer, active in Alberta and Saskatchewan from the 1920s to the 1960s. Born in St. Paul de Métis in 1908, he played an instrumental role in the formation of what are now the Métis Nation of Alberta and the Alberta Métis settlements, and spent nearly 4 decades organizing producer cooperatives in the north of the Prairie provinces. While he continues to be respectfully remembered and celebrated in Métis communities throughout the Prairie provinces, and while the legacy of his political and economic organizing continues to impact Métis across our territories, every co-op he organized would eventually fail. Brady himself was, near the end of his life, or Brady himself would come to characterize his political work ultimately as a waste. And while most Métis who know him would probably be unlikely to agree with that assessment, I think it's important that we take it seriously and explore what could have brought him to that conclusion. Brady's politics and life provide contemporary Métis with lessons regarding how we organize in our communities, interact with the colonial state, and develop and implement our political analyses. Brady was known to be a brilliant political strategist and theoretician, and a strong community organizer who believed in socialist liberation for the Métis from what he called, quote, that vicious system, end quote, by which he meant capitalist colonialism. He organized resource cooperatives in northern Indigenous communities throughout the Western Prairies for most of his life. Co-ops represented the most sustained form of project-based organizing in which he partook. While it's unclear exactly when or why Brady first took up producer cooperatives as a strategy for Métis liberation, his intentions for them remained the same across nearly 4 decades. He built an economic base from which to gain a measure of political self-determination alongside improving the lives and livelihoods of Indigenous people in the Northern Prairie provinces. The vast majority of the co-ops that Brady organized were short-lived, and at times the introduction of cooperatives to the north occurred concurrently with state-sponsored modernization initiatives that actually decreased the autonomy and well-being of the communities in which they operated. In spite of their limited success, Brady maintained the belief that co-ops were a worthwhile strategy for Indigenous people, and especially Métis, to undertake and ensure their ongoing survival. I've spoken previously about how Brady's own ideological and imaginative limitations may have contributed to the failure of the co-ops, but for this talk, I want to turn the spotlight on the motives and actions of the colonial provincial governments with and against which Brady was contending. To understand how the colonial state undercut the cooperatives and their role in Brady's larger political project, it's important to discuss Brady's politics and political goals, Métis independence, self-determination, and socialist rather than nationalist liberation through a uniquely Métis understanding of Leninism. In the early to mid-20th century, Métis were seen by the white stream as the dregs of a degenerate race, victims of the righteous march of progress, to which that they were hopelessly unsuited for. This view was part and parcel of the broader stereotype of Indigenous peoples as disappearing and dying to make way for the superior white race, but with a distinctly anti-misogynist and eugenicist twist that was predicated on Métis' supposed mixedness. White experts, quote unquote, on the Métis blamed widespread illiteracy, illness, and immiseration on inherent embodied racial characteristics. UN Commission expert Dr. Cannell, for example, says of the Métis, quote, "This same ignorance which has persisted amongst them for centuries has made them indolent and given them a subnormal mentality. All these deficiencies are conducive to laziness. Laziness predisposes to poverty, and poverty in an ignorant, indolent race means filth, and filth brings disease," end quote. So it was aggressively against these narratives that Jim Brady developed his own politics and analysis, informed both by his family's history as politically engaged Métis and the communist politics of the white immigrant laborers with whom he worked. Bringing together communist analysis and Métis history, Brady re-theorized the story of Métis peoplehood and 19th century history to center Métis political power and agency. He saw the Red River and Northwest resistances, for example, not as the last hurrahs of a backwards, maladapted people unable to stand against a superior white population, but rather as national liberation struggles that were undermined by pernicious outside influences, particularly capitalism and white occupation of indigenous lands. He writes, quote, "This transition from primitive social relations to capitalism found its political expression in the struggle to establish parliamentary democracy and responsible government, to which was added the winning of an independent national resistance. In the early Red River period, this national feeling had been coalesced in the battle against the semi-feudal decentralization of the Hudson's Bay Company regime. And after the surrender of Rupertsland, it was born of the struggle against the octopus clutch of the exploiting vanguard of white settlement," end quote. This historical reclaiming positioned Métis as intellectual and political equals in both historical and contemporary times, able to bridge their collective interests as Indigenous people with the modern socio-political, economic thought and action of the day. Socialism, and Leninism in particular, are central to Brady's historical analysis and politics. His allegiance to Leninism was apparently so strong that it has actually been described as akin to worship. But he wasn't simply parroting Lenin, neither his plans or his analysis. Brady, like communist and colonized territories across the globe in the 20s and 30s, was taking up Leninism and remixing it into useful and locally relevant theories and practices, sometimes in ways that directly contradicted the tenets of Marxism and Leninism. I suspect that, especially in the 20s and 30s, Brady believed that a global proletarian revolution was coming, and he wanted the Métis to be in a strong position to participate in it and weather it. He also saw the white working class as the Métis' natural allies, and believed that communism was inherently anti-imperialist and anti-colonial. So this belief reflected many communist movements' policies and goals at the time, policies that would eventually be tempered with the same kinds of colonial apologist progression narratives that deemed Indigenous peoples as too, quote, underdeveloped for liberation. Brady would maintain the belief, however, that solidarity with all marginalized peoples was both a liberatory tactic and a prerequisite for self-determination. Through labor organizing and strategic alliances with the white working class then, Brady hoped not only to alleviate Métis immiseration, but to build political and economic independence in advance of the proletarian revolution. While his dream of an imminent communist revolution likely faded after World War II, Brady would continue to see labor, and in particular cooperative labor, as fundamental to self-determination. In my research, I divide Brady's cooperative organizing into two waves. The pre-World War II Alberta cooperatives he organized in the late 20s through the very early 40s under UFA and social credit governments, and the post-World War II Saskatchewan co-ops he was involved in as an on and off cooperative Commonwealth Federation employee. So Brady had been involved in co-op organizing since at least the late 20s, and in 1932 he joined the Métis Association of Alberta, who were mobilizing on a mandate from Northern Alberta Métis to secure land base in the province. While many of the MAA executive, known as the Famous Five, were interested in land primarily as a way to alleviate poverty, Brady and his fellow communist Malcolm Norris saw land base as a foundation upon which the Métis could build collective political and economic strength. While Norris became in many ways the political face of this struggle, Brady was the strategist, further developing political tactics and analyses that would guide the MAA through the 30s. The centrality of a Métis land base to Brady's cooperative vision is clear when he writes, quote, "Control of our natural resources is the cornerstone upon which we must build. We must be able to conduct our own agencies of physical life and well-being. This is the self-reliant way, the independent and self-respecting way. We do not want to travel the path of a paternalistic and patronizing system of public welfare. We want our independence and initiative. These are the arms by which we shall forge our emancipation," end quote. It is important to note that Brady was firmly against the idea of Métis land as a welfare scheme, and that his political vision was in some ways contingent upon ensuring that Métis were not sucked into a ward-like relationship with the state. Unfortunately, that is almost exactly what ended up happening. The social credit government, which came into power in 1935, had inherited the half-breed problem from the United Farmers of Alberta, which had called for a commission to investigate and remedy the conditions of the Métis in the province. The minority UFA government, as has been suggested, was motivated to call for a commission in no small part as a way to try to secure the Métis vote. When the majority social credit government came into power, however, they had no impetus to conduct a fulsome inquiry or to support solutions that in any way contradicted their own political agenda. The Ewing Commission, as it came to be known, was in many ways a disaster for the MAA and Brady, who had been banking on promoting his Métis agency-centered historical narrative and arguing for land and supports for people who were capable and ready to be economically independent. Instead, the commissioners rejected even hearing any historical context, openly degraded the MAA executive members present, didn't solicit testimony from any of the Northern Métis who would be affected by their findings, and relied entirely on racist white experts, like the Dr. Cannell, who I quoted at the beginning of this presentation. In the end, the settlements were born, and the Métis finally had state-recognized land, but in a form that made it nearly impossible for Brady's dream of economic independence, fueled by collective cooperative labor, to be realized. Rather than an independent Métis land base, the early settlements looked extremely similar to reserves, and the government saw them as, and wanted them to stay, a cheap welfare replacement scheme. This impacted the co-ops in several ways. First, the Alberta government unilaterally split settlement governments from the MAA, a devastating blow to the organizers and to Brady in particular, who believed strongly that a unified Métis people was essential to building collective power. The government also installed their own supervisors on the settlements, a position that was initially akin to sort of a reserve Indian agent job, and was mostly filled by white people, including, and again, the super racist Dr. Cannell. The government also never installed a central cooperative governance board, making it extremely difficult to coordinate activities among the settlements. Many of the administrative positions of the cooperatives went to white people who at best didn't necessarily understand who the Métis were and how they operated, and at worst actively sabotaged co-op success. Because settlement members didn't own the land, they could not use the property as collateral to secure loans for farm equipment and supplies, which was standard practice among farmers and operators elsewhere, meaning that the Métis were already always behind technologically and materially. In addition, the most successful co-ops of the time, including the Canadian Wheat Pool, relied heavily on government support and intervention to remain solvent and supportive of its membership, even though in the case of the Wheat Pool, it represented primarily well-established middle-class farmers. For the settlements, the government was not even willing to provide insurance against market fluctuations or seasonal scarcity. This meant that the new fish and timber co-ops on the settlements, even when they did get off the ground and managed to replace welfare, which happened at the very least with the Atikamekw collective fisheries, they couldn't be sustained. While the government claimed to want to lift destitute Métis out of poverty and integrate them into the mainstream economy, it refused to provide the necessary startup or maintenance support to achieve this. By 1942, after 2 years as supervisor of Wolf Lake Settlement, Brady had mostly given up on the settlements as a possible vehicle for Métis self-determination. Brady's experiences in Alberta may have further convinced him that Métis interests were best served by joining the larger worker struggle. He had learned from his decade of organizing in Alberta that it wasn't enough to simply organize Métis at the base producer level as cooperative members. Métis also needed to have more control over their labor output and its administration. He notes in 1942 that, quote, "If we begin with minor cooperative ventures, bringing about Métis rehabilitation depends to a great extent on the organizers or the skilled technical workers who could be won step by step to the side of cooperative principles of organization," end quote. White managers, settlement supervisors, and department officials had, sometimes actively, worked against the interests of the Métis, and white control over Métis labor had been a deciding factor in the weakening of the co-ops. Speaking of future cooperative organizing, Brady asserts that, quote, "A crucial factor in further improvement will be whatever stimulates the interests of the native member. This is not a concession to the individualistic spirit. The appeal to self-interest is essential in this work among natives, and when it is lacking, disaster follows," end quote. This thinking may be in part what convinced him to agree to Norris's request that Brady take over his post at Deschambault Lake, Saskatchewan, as a Department of Natural Resources field officer in 1947, the beginning of his employment with the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation. It would also prove to be a prescient comment, as Brady would find that the socialists were as reluctant as the capitalists had been to make space for Indigenous management in the cooperative structure. While the CCF was, especially in comparison to the social credit government in Alberta, enthusiastic about organizing northern producer cooperatives, the CCF saw co-ops not as vehicles for Indigenous independence, but rather as mechanisms for assimilation. David Queering describes how the CCF used socialism to justify colonialism, saying, quote, "Eurocentrism appeared even more strongly in the CCF than in some other sectors of society. The idealists of the party believed in the perfectibility of society, and that the group to which they had belonged had progressed further towards perfection than any other in the history of humankind. Additional justification for assimilation came from the socialist use of class analysis. This theory minimized the importance of and even discouraged preserving racial and cultural distinctions, end quote. This ideological standpoint manifested through their explicitly assimilatory policies throughout the province, but particularly in the north. Cooperative development was used as a form of modern community development that would convince Indigenous Northerners of the superiority of white society while integrating them into the modern economy. In addition, the CCF came to prioritize co-ops as a way to open up Saskatchewan's north for resource extraction to enrich the south. So the benefits of new industry would not be applied equally, nor would the self-congratulatory egalitarianism of the CCF extend to Indigenous workers. Métis were still seen as deficient and were excluded from nearly all work outside of manual labor and opportunities for advancement. And similar to the Ewing Commission's take on the causes of contemporary Métis socioeconomic conditions, while the socialist government was quick to blame poverty and social issues on the injustices of the capitalist system, the blame for Métis destitution was often attributed to the Métis themselves. Additionally, the co-ops were rife with discrimination at nearly every level. Laurie Barron notes that, quote, departmental reports clearly indicate that, despite government incentives and prodding, Métis found most co-op ventures, especially producer cooperatives, an alienating and unworkable experience, end quote. For one thing, government trading stores initially only dealt in cash, making them inaccessible to the majority of Métis who were accustomed to operating on credit. Again, management and administrative positions within production plants, marketing boards, and co-op stores were given mostly to whites, often people who were not from the communities in which they worked. These two factors contributed to Métis not wanting to deal with cooperative agents. Additionally, more lucrative work in mining and timber was dominated almost exclusively by whites. Indigenous laborers were relegated to the lower income fish and fur economies. Government policies also discriminated against Northern Indigenous co-op members financially. The DNR, for example, chose to sink fisheries profits into welfare and industry improvement rather than circulating that wealth back to co-op members in the form of higher prices for their catch, contributing to and sometimes increasing their financial precarity. Distribution inequality was also an issue across the province as a whole. Reports highlighted the disparities between the new resource-generated wealth being enjoyed in the south and the meager distribution of that same capital in the north. These reports were subsequently repressed. And perhaps most fundamentally, CCF officials had significantly overestimated the capacity of Indigenous northern resource economies. The Indigenous industries, regulated by the CCF, could not meet the needs of the Indigenous population. As economic conditions worsened, racist fears of freeloading natives fueled stingy health, welfare, and education benefits in the north, while the south continued to thrive off the profits of northern industry. By 1956, only 45% of fishers in the north were co-op members, and most of the co-ops existed in name only. While the government chose to blame the fishers for their lack of engagement, the top-down control of the co-ops made local engagement difficult, and the blatant paternalism of the generally white officials further discouraged local input. Brady, by this point, had ceased organizing with the CCF, in part because of his disgust with their operations. The progressive, socialist leanings of the CCF left no space for Métis to organize collectively as Métis, instead relegating them to the same kinds of economic and social marginalization that Alberta Métis had experienced on the settlements. The CCF continued to restructure the economy with no input from and little engagement with Indigenous Northerners, and as one report found, quote, the government's policies were totally disrupting the stability of the Métis traditional life pattern and replacing it with social and economic chaos, end quote. In the final years of his life, Brady was politically alienated from the CCF. His bitterness toward them is evident when he writes to Norris, quote, after 20 years of monumental blundering in the CCF in the north are no longer a political force. The Métis and Indians detest them. You know the CCF administration has always had a class-induced fear of the natives. They could never see beyond the standard administrational approach and the methods of the classical colonialist, end quote. While the Alberta provincial governments withheld the resources necessary for the co-ops of the Métis settlements to become self-sustaining, the CCF government in Saskatchewan supported the co-ops they instituted in the north, but in doing so came to heavily administrate them, limiting both co-op success and the control that local members could wield over their own labor conditions. In neither case was either government prepared to consider the co-ops as a means to build Métis economic and political self-determination. While Brady may have thought he could have siphoned the resources of the state to provide the material and educational support needed for northern co-ops to become sites of political self-determination, the government's unwavering grip on the administration and wealth of the north rendered that kind of division impossible. Interestingly, Brady came to characterize the relative neglect of the social credit as preferable to the overly bureaucratic system of the CCF, stating, quote, I actually got far better support and understanding from the Alberta government than I got from our own CCF government of Saskatchewan. They were more fully aware of the necessity for doing things. That's rather odd in view of the fact that they were a reactionary social credit government and in many respects fascist-minded in some of their attitudes. but nevertheless, they were far more realistic, I believe, end quote. While there is no indication that he ever gave up on cooperative organizing as a fundamental part of his political vision, nor on the centrality of solidarity between Indigenous people and white workers, at the end of his life, it seems that Brady had learned that neither capitalist nor socialist governments would facilitate Métis political and economic self-determination. The lesson was a deeply bitter one for the organizer. While he would come to characterize his lifetime of organizing as wasted, Brady's work and legacy has had far-reaching impacts on Métis people and politics across the prairies and beyond. And even what he would have considered his biggest defeats contain a vital lesson for contemporary Métis radicals. The colonial state will never support our self-determination, and any gains we make will be on their terms and part of their agenda. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Molly, for this fantastic presentation. So Amanda, I will turn to you and see if we have any questions. We're going to take a few. We can't hear you, Amanda.
Sorry, there's my mute button. I was just saying we're just going to wait for the chat to catch up a little bit. No questions yet. Nathalie, did you have any questions for Molly?
Well, I may have one. I know that Brady was a supervisor for the Walsh Lake area, and I was just wondering, through his writing, you know, like how did it recall his time, you know, when he was a supervisor, and what are the issues that he was facing also, you know, not just with the government, but with their issues with the community?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. Thank you. So Brady, I think when the settlements were first established and he was first sort of took up that position as a supervisor, I think he still maintained a certain amount of hope that he could sort of realize his political vision and that they could become an independent land base for self-determination, Métis economic self-determination. But his journals express a lot of frustration, both with the government, as well as with his fellow MAA members like Joe Dion and settlements inhabitants themselves. So Joe Dion worked with Father Lacombe to try to bring religious education onto the settlements, which Brady was extremely against. He felt that while he was really, you know, he believed in religious inclusivity and tolerance, he did feel that the Roman Catholic Church in particular had betrayed the Métis in the Northwest Resistance, and so was reluctant to have that influence on the settlements. When it comes to how he felt about the Métis inhabitants, yeah, there's a lot of frustrations because he's sort of trying to balance his role as this sort of like Indian agent-esque position with the fact that he, you know, is a grassroots organizer and he cares deeply about folks. He talks about how certain Métis are undercutting the cooperative initiatives by doing things like posing as game wardens, stealing government lumber, you know, sort of, you know, that interpersonal conflict that he keeps being brought in to sort of mitigate and navigate. And he's trying to figure out, you know, ways of doing this without bringing in sort of, you know, the outside justice system and to get these things fixed up in ways that are, you know, culturally relevant and acceptable. And I think that, you know, he keeps running up against so many sort of state imposed limitations as well. And so I know by, you know, 1942, he's ready to wash his hands of it, which is really too bad. And he never sort of comes back around to the idea of the settlements, which ultimately, you know, doesn't matter because Métis people who've been living on the settlements for the past, you know, decades have done the work to emancipate themselves out of that system and to self-administrate, which is really important. But I do know that for Brady, he never seems to have come back around to that idea, and he was not heavily involved with organizing for a land base in Saskatchewan, which I think says a lot too.
Thank you. Amanda, do we have a question?
We do. Wyatt asks, what are your thoughts about the future of Métis organizing in Alberta?
Oh my God, that's a great question, Wyatt. Thank you. I see a lot of really good work and conversations happening among Métis, not just in Alberta, but sort of interprovincially and in the territories as well. And then also not even just like both among Métis ourselves, but then between Métis and other communities. And so I have a lot of hope, you know, especially with the advent of the internet and that kind of thing. It's so much easier for us to communicate with one another and to plan and to collaborate. And I think, you know, thinking about Brady's politics and the emphasis that he really placed on solidarity and collective liberation, and the fact that he really saw, you know, working together, marginalized populations working together as a prerequisite for liberation, this idea that no one's free till we're all free. You know, I think a lot more of that kind of work is happening. And I think, well, the past few decades, we've seen a lot of, especially, you know, among Métis sort of delineations between our peoples and among our peoples in our political organizations and stuff. I see a lot of the grassroots doing that collective work together and that solidarity-based work, and that is really exciting and gives me a lot of hope for the future.
Thank you very much, Molly. Do we have another question or?
Not yet.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Molly. So we're going to go to our next speaker, Leah Hrycun. Leah Hrycun is a first-year PhD student in the Faculty of Native Studies. She is a settler of Ukrainian, German, and Jewish ancestry on Treaty 6 territory and the Métis homeland. Her research interests include Métis histories, repatriation, material culture, Indigenous settler relations, and critical whiteness studies. The title of her presentation is Heartwork, Weaving Relationality into Métis Material Culture Repatriation. So Leah, your turn.
Thank you very much, Natalie, for that great introduction. Let me just share my screen with you here. Okay, I hope you're able to see my screen properly. So as Natalie said, my name is Leah Hrycun, and I am a PhD student in the Faculty of Native Studies. I had the great pleasure of doing my master's and in the Faculty of Native Studies as well. And this work that I'm going to share with you today is a result of the research that I undertook as a part of my master's program. So the Métis Nation of Alberta has clearly expressed interest in furthering the repatriation of Métis material culture to Métis in Alberta. However, current policies and the ways in which material culture are defined make legislative and policy options for repatriation unavailable to Métis in Alberta. Within the current framework, material culture that has been classified as sacred or ceremonial is eligible for repatriation from the Royal Alberta Museum and Glenbow Alberta Institute. This classification has allowed for the return of objects that are integral to Blackfoot sacred ceremonies and traditions. However, objects that are not classified as sacred or ceremonial are not eligible for repatriation. For Métis, material culture held in collections has historically been mislabeled and miscategorized, and often attributed to other Indigenous groups. As a result of these colonial categories and the misclassification of Métis material culture, current repatriation frameworks are ineffective for Métis to regain care and control over their material culture. So the purpose of this study was to explore the desires of Métis individuals in Alberta and advance repatriation, to analyze their views on the role that museums played in continuing to hold material culture. It was anticipated that articulating the desires of Métis individuals to advance repatriation and creating space to open dialogues between Métis and museum professionals would make clear the need for a Métis-specific framework, and recognize the unique needs and desires of Métis. Further, by identifying how current policies reinforce a colonial notion of museum collections, it was expected that a new framework for museums could be constructed, one that advances decolonization and reconciliation by empowering Métis with agency over their material culture and re-engaging communities with items central to their identity. This study serves as a foundation from which a Métis-specific framework for repatriation can be negotiated between Métis in Alberta and federal and provincial governments. To explore these issues, this study addressed the following research questions. So first, how have colonial practices regarding the collection and retention of material culture contributed to Métis dispossession? Second, what is the importance of repatriation to Métis communities in Alberta? And third, what does a Métis-specific framework for repatriation look like? As recently as the 1980s, repatriation was inconceivable to museums in Canada. Many museums were concerned that repatriation would lead to a deterioration or destruction of items intrinsic to human history. Museum professionals also feared that repatriation would mean involvement with Indigenous communities and that they could lose their research objectivity as a result of the relationships formed. In addition, museums considered themselves to be the owners of the artifacts held in their collections. These widespread views combined to make the idea of repatriation impossible. Currently, there is no federal legislation in Canada regarding repatriation. Scholars are divided on the necessity of introducing legislation, as well as on the efficacy of such legislation. In Alberta, the First Nations Sacred and Ceremonial Object Repatriation Act enables the repatriation of First Nations sacred and ceremonial objects from Alberta provincial collections, for example, the Royal Alberta Museum and the Glenbow, to First Nations in Canada. Finscora requires compliance with strict classifications of material culture as sacred or ceremonial, is applied at the discretion of government officials, applies only to provincial museums, and as such, effectively falls to museums to administer. Further, these strict classifications, as set out in Finscora, make repatriation unavailable to Métis. Scholars have questioned why Métis rights have been continually ignored. As to why Métis have been forgotten as an Indigenous rights-bearing people, Isaac posits that the unique emergence of Métis in populations in Western Canada and the inability of Canadian law to recognize those who do not, quote, fit into an easily identifiable legal box, end quote, have disadvantaged Métis in their ability to exercise their Aboriginal rights. The present exclusion and marginalization of Métis is deeply rooted in the history of the lands known as Canada. Indeed, Chartier argues that these histories and the marginalization faced by Métis were the impetus for many Métis people to part with their material culture and for these items to ultimately end up in museums. A significant body of literature on repatriation has emerged since the 1980s. The focus of repatriation literature ranges from the politics and legalities of repatriation to the Indigenous right to repatriation. According to Gerald Conady, former director of the Glenbow Museum, quote, repatriation represents an assertion of the human right to freedom of religion, of religious expression and cultural identity, end quote. For others, such as Sean Robertson, the Indigenous right to repatriation furthers self-determination and the exercise of sovereignty. Repatriation not only furthers sovereignty, it also subverts assimilative pressures of white settler states and creates space for Indigenous people to maintain their unique culture and identity, and thus is a vital component in the creation of an equitable, diverse, and respectful society. For Métis scholars, self-determination involves the ability to have access to histories and present realities and to visualize a future for Métis. Accordingly, they argue that material culture is of vital importance to Métis identity and self-determination. And, according to scholar Henderson Youngblood, it is no longer a matter of whether, but when self-determination negotiations begin. And once they do, the exercise of self-determination will decolonize existing structures and foster justice for Métis. So this study found that at present, museums are not in good relation with Métis and are not practicing Métis relationality, which is the keystone to Métis repatriation. While museums are espousing their commitments to further Indigenous repatriation, they evince no desire to give up power, ownership, and control that they currently have over Métis material culture. Before Métis repatriation frameworks can succeed, museums must take steps necessary to be in good relation or practice Wokotoin with Métis communities. The original intent of this study was to bring research participants together to discuss the importance of material culture to self-determination and to open discussions surrounding Métis-specific repatriation with the Royal Alberta Museum, or the RAM. In January 2020, I was advised by the RAM that they were not willing to participate in discussions surrounding Métis repatriation. Well, those I spoke with at the museum stated that their inability to open dialogues of repatriation with Métis were due to cutbacks. The information gathered through this research process suggests that cutbacks were not the only reason for their disinterest. Indeed, the RAM has made significant changes to its repatriation webpage, including the alarming removal of references to the TRC's calls to action and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It has also removed Inuit and Métis from their community engagement page and repatriation references. Additionally, human rights complaints and accusations of institutional racisms have been leveled against the RAM. It is clear that while the RAM espouses its virtue in supporting and facilitating repatriation, there has been little intention to actually do so. Indeed, the research participants highlighted the ways in which museums could build relationality through access, through transparency, and through having community liaisons whose sole focus was relationship building, not being weighed down with administrative burdens. For one research participant, Connie, she stated that if our stories are closed in a box or stored in a basement, who gets to read them and how? For Dawn, it was about accessing records. She would really like to see more knowledge about knowing what's where. You know, and I know that there are some things in the Glenbow, but understanding what is in collections. How do museums let people know that this stuff is here? This study also found that participants view museums as places of learning, and as such, museums should be accountable for the knowledges they reproduce. This study confirms that museums need to recognize the role they play in knowledge production and dissemination. It concludes that museums must incorporate Métis narratives into their interpretation in order to educate public about Métis histories, realities, and futurities. And sorry, I actually missed a couple of slides here. Let me go back to these. So the second major finding in this research was that there is a complete misunderstanding of what Métis identity is. For one of the research participants, Josh, he stated that it really affects people understanding who are the Métis people in Canada. That's still a question that is asked today. Who are Métis? How can you be Métis? I'm used to people asking, so what is a Métis person? Or I have a First Nations great-great-grandmother, so am I Métis now? The research participants all stated that this misinformation was perpetuated by museums and did nothing to further Métis self-determination. Tanya also spoke greatly about identity, and she said that one of the main problems with the museum setting was that there was an automatic assumption that when they're presenting Métis material culture, they're presenting a culture that no longer exists. Further, one of the research participants, Norma, stated, because Métis history, culture, and traditions were suppressed for so many years after the resistance, a lot of our people are only learning about their roots now. And having access to that material culture will explain why the Métis Nation is striving for self-determination and self-government. So as I was stating before, the study also found that the participants all viewed museums as places of learning, and as such, museums should be held accountable for the knowledges they produce. To do this, museum professionals must be in good relation with Métis. This includes being educated in Métis methodologies for interpretation and upsetting the colonial power structures that perpetuate the objectification of Métis in museums. Museums can begin pushing against power structures by engaging in research projects that recover the narratives of the material culture they house, consulting with community, and challenging colonial ideas of the ownership of material culture by practicing true stewardship. For Krista, this expands the relationship. If you are a steward of our stuff, that means you also need to support our modern artists and sell their work in your shop. That's so important. It speaks to Métis. Well, we as Métis people, we're not just from the past. We are still here. We're still going to be here. You can't get rid of us. But so supporting that, but in a respectful way, end quote. This also means that museums must acknowledge their role in the continued dispossession of Métis from their material culture and engage in true reconciliation, part of which includes repatriation. Finally, this study found that repatriation is very important to Métis in Alberta, and that most participants believe that there should be a framework for Métis-specific repatriation. A Métis-specific repatriation framework should be centered in Métis relationality and further the needs and desires of Métis in Alberta to exercise care and control over their material culture. As a result, this study finds that museums should immediately enter negotiations with Métis to create a framework for the repatriation of Métis material culture in Alberta that is centered in Métis relationality. So in conclusion, repatriation is very important to Métis in Alberta. From a Métis perspective, repatriation includes the exercise of self-determination through the care, control, and repatriation of their material culture. For this to occur, museums must practice Métis relationality. First, museums must acknowledge their role in dispossessing Métis of their material culture and their role in perpetuating a white supremacist state. Second, museums must be actively anti-colonial by incorporating Métis knowledges into their collection management. This includes actively working to recover object narratives of Métis material culture, ensuring that Métis material culture is no longer mislabeled, and acknowledging that they are stewards, not owners, of Métis material culture. This also means that museums must acknowledge their role in knowledge production and create spaces in which Métis can exercise self-determination by telling their own stories that acknowledge the histories of Métis and honor present and future Métis culture and identity. In order to meet any of these requirements, museums must first and foremost begin the process of building relationships with Métis in Alberta. It is only when Métis have control of and access to their own material culture that dialogues about physical repatriation can begin. New relationships are developing between Métis in Alberta and federal governments. On November 16th, 2017, the Métis Nation of Alberta entered into an agreement with the governments of Canada and Alberta to negotiate Métis rights on a nation-to-nation basis in order to advance reconciliation. And on June 27th, 2019, the MNA signed a self-government agreement with the Government of Canada. These agreements hold the potential for Métis self-determination and sovereignty, and with them, the potential for multiple opportunities to promote reconciliation and to answer the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Furthermore, they may lay a foundation for negotiating a Métis-specific framework for the repatriation of Métis material culture. As our research has demonstrated, the time has come to do so. A Métis-specific framework for repatriation is urgently needed in Alberta. And before I close, I would like to, of course, thank you to the 9 lovely individuals who participated in this research project. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Leah, for this great presentation. So we're going to take questions now.
Our first question is from Molly. She asks, have you seen any positive examples of repatriation procedures with Métis material culture?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Molly. There have been some private initiatives that have taken place between individuals and museums that are Indigenous or Métis run. So one of the examples that I can think of off the top of my head was recently a family found a number of pieces of Métis material culture that their grandmother received while she was a nurse at a hospital. The family contacted a Métis run museum in northern Manitoba, and the objects were then repatriated to that museum in Manitoba. Unfortunately, that's one of the very few. I know that there are a number of Métis individuals, for example, Gregory Schofield, who are taking it upon themselves to purchase Métis material culture that might otherwise end up in the hands of someone else, with the hopes that it will be kept for a time and place when it can be be used or reintroduced to its communities. So unfortunately, there's not, well, fortunately, there is some progress being made. Unfortunately, it's not being made at a governmental or at a policy level, and it's being left up to individuals to further repatriation.
Other questions?
Yes, I've got a twofold question here from Kimberly. She asks, have you had any response from the museums based off of your work, and are there next steps that you and the community are considering?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that question. Unfortunately, not a lot has been going on in the time of COVID. I just finished this research this summer, and so I have not had too much response from museums yet. I know that the Royal Alberta Museum is undergoing significant staffing changes and a lot of upheaval right now. And so there's actually nobody there who's willing to talk to us at this moment. However, some of the smaller museums, Musée Héritage in St. Albert, has been really supportive of this initiative. And had it not been for COVID, we would be working a lot more closely with them on this initiative. One of the things that is going to be coming out of this research, or I hope to come out of this research, is that I would like to turn my dissertation into a much more digestible report that, that can then be circulated to museums so that they have a better idea of how they can begin practicing Métis relationality in order to start these conversations. And so my hope is that in the new year, I can get started on that a little bit more. And of course, as we're able to come back together more, I hope that we're able to open those dialogues again.
Thank you. And then our next question is from Dawn, who asks if, pardon me, if not, it's a Métis curated exhibit, and the museum gave the community control over objects that are displayed, and then the stories that were told. Okay, so it's more of a comment.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. This was something that was discussed a lot with the research participants of how they could reclaim space without physical repatriation. And one of the ways that they talked about reclaiming space is to have Métis interpretation and Métis control over the exhibits that are put in a museum. A lot of people expressed a lot of interest in continuing to have exhibits to educate the public about who Métis are and what Métis identity is and what it means to be Métis in the future and in the present. And so there was a lot of talk about how that could be facilitated in a respectful way that really highlighted true stewardship of objects.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, I actually missed the first part of Dawn's question here. They ask, in your research, do you come across the work that the Métis community in the Sundre area of Alberta did with their local museum? Apologies, Dawn.
I actually haven't. Unfortunately, I will have to investigate that a little bit further. The focus of this research originally was for the major provincial institutions, the Royal Alberta Museum and the Glenbow. And so then and because of COVID, we had to adapt and change. And so we weren't able to open up the conversation as much as we wanted to, but it is my hope that we'll get to do that in the future. And I will definitely take note that that the Métis community in Sundre is doing some good work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leah. So our next speaker is David Parent. David Parent is currently a PhD candidate in the Faculty of Native Studies and Sociology at the University of Alberta, as well as an instructor in the departments of History and Indigenous Studies at the University of Manitoba. David's research focuses on the dispossession of his family, the Monkmans, as well as other related families from their lands in Manitoba's Interlake region. David's presentation is Governing Indigeneity, Dispossessing and Managing Métis in Manitoba during the Mid-20th century. Your turn, David.
Okay, thank you very much, Natalie. Okay, do you guys see the, I just want to check, you see the presentation and not my presenter notes? Could someone tell me? Okay, good. Okay, awesome. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm really excited to be here today and presenting along some of my favorite co-thinkers and friends. Maybe some more antagonistic relationships, who knows? You know, some people I've been thinking with for a long time. So as you know, you've been introduced to me, I'm David. So I'm going to talk about my dissertation today. It's currently off in committee land and we'll see how that goes, but this is essentially where I'm at with it. So I came to this research following my master's research where I did an oral history project with my grandmother, Rosie Monkman, along with her brother and cousins concerning their everyday lives growing up in Minnewacan, a small Métis community located in Manitoba's Interlake, just north of St. Laurent. And it's on the map here. During our interviews, one of the quotes that stuck with me was from my grandmother when I asked her why she left Minnewacan. Her response, well, if you were a Monkman, you got the hell out of Dodge. For her, leaving Minnewacan meant leaving the hard life that her and her extended family lived during the 1940s and 50s, living in poorly constructed homes, hauling water from the slough, and living without many of the benefits of modern day technologies that were becoming commonplace during the post-war era. When I had initially started my PhD, my goal was to do research on Métis migration from the prairies to places outside of the homeland like Vancouver, where I was born. However, in the early days of January 2019, I received a fateful Facebook message that had me completely change course. That message was from a woman named Diane Malcolm. And I know Diane's in the chat, so hi, Diane. Diane just happened to be the daughter of my great-grandmother's friend, Lucy, pictured here. Lucy had come up many times during my oral history project. Our mutual friend, Pat Roberts, had sent Diane my MA thesis, and Diane contacted me to ask me more about my research and to encourage me to do more research about Minnewacan. While I had provided stories about the Monkman and the McLeod families, there was very little about her family and the other Métis families, such as the Chartrands, Luciers, and Forbisters. For the next week, Diane and I messaged back and forth as she sent me pictures and documents that she had, many of which had been preserved by her mother, Lucy. Amongst those documents was a simple bylaw enforcement letter addressed to over a dozen members of the Monkman family, informing them that they had failed to pay their taxes and that the lands listed on the document were to be repossessed by the municipality. That's in this photo right here. The sections of land that were included in this document, I quickly learned, corresponded to Monkman Point, a section of land that had been reserved first for the HBC through the Dominion Land Survey, and then subsequently reserved for James Monkman Jr. and his heirs following the administration of Métis lands and homesteading during the late 1800s. The bylaw demonstrated something that I had known through oral history, but had yet to demonstrate through archival sources. The Monkmans and many of the families in Minnewacan were not squatters or road allowance people. Rather, they were homesteaders. Rather, they had been one of the few groups of Métis families who had managed to secure lands during the later years of the 1800s. Now, dominant narratives of Métis history, whether historically posed by Douglas Sprague, Gerhard Enns, or more recently Jean Taillé, have mainly focused on the loss of Métis lands in Manitoba and the subsequent exodus of Métis westward. Lost in this meta-narrative of dispossession are the families who remained in Manitoba, and importantly, those who managed to maintain their indigeneity, that is, their relationally produced relationships to place and each other. The bylaw demonstrated for me that my family and extended relations had been able to endure the initial wave of settler colonial land dispossession that visited Manitoba in the late 1800s. I approach indigeneity as a form of sociality. That is, that it has its basis in the social interactions between people and between place. Indigeneity is not some kind of inherent social form. I'm not talking about blood memory because I don't really think that exists, but rather it requires social interaction and is produced between people. Theoretically, this dissertation is concerned with understanding how indigeneity, as a mutually constitutive relationship between a people and a place that existed prior to settler colonial invasion, became governed by the multiple levels of settler colonial governments and municipalities in particular throughout the mid-20th century. This goal came out of visiting that I did with descendants from Minnewacan, including Diane. During our visits, a recurring question kept coming up. What happened to Minnewacan, and what happened to all of our family's land? How did they lose it? How did we lose our land? In these pictures above, the one of the kids fishing is that's my grandmother and her brother and sister, and then below that is one of Diane's relatives, and then the top corner is a portrait of my family again, and then below there's some pretty cool guys that are, and I believe they have muskrats. And I just want to thank Diane again. She's been the one who's provided me access to these photos, and also thank Lucy, because without her, we wouldn't have this archive to work with. So at the heart of what happened to Minnewacan is another question. How was Minnewacan governed? Now, Michel Foucault's tracing of what he termed governmentality emerged for me as a durable methodological framework for tracing the governing of Métis indigeneity. In his lectures, Foucault describes the growth of townships in Europe as models for understanding the dispositions and means through which governments govern. Government has as its core an apparatus of technologies such as taxes, bylaws, or public health testing that possess the goal for ensuring the security of its targeted population and territory. Through gathering information about the population and territory, the apparatus is then able to provide programs to ensure the security of the territory and the population. That is, in Foucault, I found a conceptual language for tracing the ways in which populations and territories are governed through a disposition of security, or, as Aileen Morton Robinson has aptly theorized, white possessiveness. While useful in the context of Europe, Foucault's governmentality framework fell short for completely interrogating how settler colonialism and governmentality interface. For such insights, I turned to Indigenous studies scholars and settler colonial studies scholars for further theorizations. What distinguishes settler colonialism from other forms of colonialism, such as mercantile, is its territorialization of a settler population. Furthermore, in building from Patrick Wolf's theorization of settler colonialism as eliminatory, settler colonial governments operate with an eliminatory impulse that results in the deterritorialization and depopulating of Indigenous peoples, placing them in conditions of insecurity, as opposed to the positive form of governmentality that Foucault speaks about. Settler colonialism, however, is more than simply eliminatory. As Indigenous studies scholars have demonstrated, settler colonial apparatuses are also highly productive as they recast Indigenous peoples as racialized populations for governing purposes. With the growth of settler colonial apparatuses, indigeneity is produced and then iterated and reiterated, to quote Cree scholar Jessica Call-Pennock, into governable forms such as Indian, half-breed, Métis, Native American, among others. Indigeneity through this process becomes known in order for it to become legible and therefore governable. As Chris Anderson argues, Indigenous peoples are transformed by settler colonial technologies such as censuses, among other technologies, into racial populations. As racialized populations, Indigenous populations become governed differentially in order to maintain the norms and normalization of white populations, and in order to manage Indigenous sovereignty to protect white patriarchal sovereignty, to echo Aileen Morton Robinson. What became clear in my literature reviews of other racialized populations during the post-war era, from the displacing of Black communities in Africville in Nova Scotia or Hogan's Alley in Vancouver, or the attempted use of gentrification to force out the Chinese community in Vancouver's Strathcona neighborhood, most recently documented by historian Tina Liu, the elimination of racialized communities come populations was diffuse amongst municipalities across Canada. That is, Métis were not alone in sharing experiences of dispossession during the mid-20th century as municipal governments increased their ability to govern their local populations and territories and to eliminate those racialized populations for the benefit of white populations. In Manitoba, the seeds of settler colonial governmentality were sown with the signing of the Manitoba Act in 1870. That the Manitoba Act, along with the violence of the Wolseley expedition, produced the conditions of possibility for the establishment of what would become the provincial apparatus that could apply its settler colonial programs of settlement through the Dominions Land Act, as well as the administration of Métis scrip. The Dominion Land Survey provided the province and the Dominion with an intelligible grid of the Northwest and provided a settlement scheme through pre-planned townships, a model that is at its core about settlement and as Foucault elaborated, governmentality. This grid and the eventual homesteading that happened as a result organized how Métis families could relate to place and to each other. As even the most conservative historians of Métis scrip allocation, such as Thomas Flanagan and Gerhard Enns, recognize that through this administration, Métis scrip produced a racial regime of property, to echo legal scholar Brenna Bandar. That is, white scholars in the land economy of the late 19th century would often receive more for their property than half-breeds, and Métis received even less than half-breeds still. Furthermore, the schism between Métis people was further fractured by who would be able to take advantage of the Dominion Land Survey and who would fall victim to this new regime of property. For the Métis of Minnewacan, who had already been living in a relatively settled life on the shores of Lake Manitoba, primarily fishing, trapping, and raising cattle, the Dominion Lands Act didn't produce the same kinds of dispossessive effects as it did for Métis families still invested in the buffalo economy. However, it is the second group of Métis that tend to take the center stage when discussing Métis history. This project is a stark departure from that view, to bring into focus how Métis who stayed in Manitoba endured until the mid-20th century. Suffice to say, the establishment of the provincial apparatus, with the establishment of the provincial apparatus came the administration of settlement along a geographic grid. This administration led to the territorialization of a white settler population on the Northwest. By the 1890s, a new level of apparatus was being produced as townships began organizing into municipalities. For Métis Manitoba, who had managed to secure land during the administration of scrip and homesteading, these municipalities would become the settler colonial apparatuses that administered their dispossession in the mid-20th century. Métis during the mid-20th century in Manitoba, I argue, were not hiding in plain sight as the common narrative would have us believe. Rather, they were being governed in plain sight. Nowhere was this governing more apparent than in municipal contexts, where the power to eliminate people from place, that is their indigeneity, was ever present. And we can see this in cases of the St. Madeleine community in Western Manitoba, in Roostertown in Winnipeg, in Week City in Winnipeg. And these accounts, of course, have been more recently chronicled both by Owen Taves and Evelyn Peters. Now, the primary technologies through which settler colonial municipal apparatuses dispossessed Métis people in Manitoba and Métis people in Minnewacan specifically was through the use of bylaws and property taxes, the same bylaw that Lucie Lucier preserved for so many years. Deposited in the Manitoba archives are the rural municipality of Coldwell's tax rolls, bylaws, and municipal council minutes. These documents, when put together, provide the ability to cohere a settler colonial script of dispossession. And this is the municipality that ended up growing up around Minnewacan. So what did these settler colonial technologies look like in practice? Here we have a tax roll from 1946 that shows Alexander Monkman, the brother of my great-grandmother, who still owned a section of land on section 1220-6 in the Minnewacan town site. In this picture, exactly, he owned 6 acres to be exact. Now, bylaw 358 from that same year shows the same piece of land as being repossessed by the municipality. The sections were repossessed because Alexander owed $183.84 on one section and $9.36 on the other section. However, here's the settler colonial rub. Bylaw 422 demonstrates that John Bjorn Arnfinsen, an Icelander, received Alexander Monkman's repossessed lands for a mere $100. About half the cost of what Alexander lost the land to the municipality for. And this is only one instance among many others. So, and I go through this in the dissertation at quite detailed length. But the question you're probably wanting to know is how much land was lost and over how long. So for this, I provide you what I call four cross sections of dispossession. So in 1915, after homesteading was pretty much done and the area was settled, there were 25 primary Métis landowners that you can see on here with names like Sinclair, Forbister, McLeod, Monkman, and so on. Now, of those 26 Métis landowners recorded in the 1915 homestead map, there remained 13 by 1946. The community went from owning 4,000 to 2,000 acres of land. Between 1946 and 1960, Métis and Minnewacan lost another 1,500 acres of land. About 500 acres remained. Finally, by 1970, only one 10-acre parcel of land, a part of section 1220-6, was still in the hands of a Métis person. So how did we lose our land? To go back to the question that was asked me by my relatives and friends up in Minnewacan. Well, it happened through taxation and bylaws at the level of the municipality. Moreover, when actually looking at the minutes and the bylaws, it's striking to see that those serving on the council or people who are related to those serving on the council were the ones who were benefiting from the tax sales. Those were the ones who were getting the deals. And you can sort of see in this how this microcosm of the rural municipality, how this disposition of white possessiveness is completely at play. Now, the municipal apparatus produced the racial effects in that it eliminated Métis property owners and then sold those property to white residents for a fraction of the price, and thus bolstering the white population in the area at the expense of Métis. All of these processes required, of course, that the displacement of other populations was to be normalized amongst dominant Canadian society. And in the dissertation, I get into this a bit more in I was also complaining, but in comparing how white populations get moved by the federal government, and then how racialized populations are dealt with at the level of the municipality. And you can really see how white populations are treated so much better and with care, whereas racialized populations get targeted as problem populations to be solved. So this is all quite grim, and it's sad to see how much land we lost. So then, what's a possible, how do we look towards the future? Well, my buddy's right here. So here we have land back. So lately, the slogan land back has become commonplace on social media and the news more generally. What is better is that it has also become materialized. Funny enough, my fellow panelists today have been successful in purchasing in their own historic Métis community some land. It's certainly a desire of me that I would be able to purchase Monkman Point, which was the place that was listed on the bylaw letter, back for my family and for other members of that historic community to use for things like family gatherings and such. So unfortunately, though, some people have taken issue with Métis taking the pragmatic stance of buying back lands within the current property regime, as if to assume that any of us exist outside the reaches of settler colonial power. Perhaps waiting for capitalism to die, for Indigenous peoples to live, might bring us feelings of peace, power, and righteousness, but it certainly isn't resulting in the re-territorializing of our homelands. For that, we must depend on ourselves and the continued growth of our social, political governments and institutions. And I finished my dissertation talking about the growth of the Manitoba Métis Federation as a governing apparatus for Métis by providing housing loan programs and other sorts of programs that allow us to repopulate and to re-territorialize in our homelands. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David, for this fantastic presentation. And it's a great way to try on, doing your presentation for your PhD defense. So do we have any questions for David?
Yes, we do. Our first question is from Molly. She asks, in your opinion, does racialization in the way that you're talking about happen primarily through state administration, i.e. is it a top-down process?
No, I think in terms of managing the creation of the population and the identification through technologies, certainly. When we look at censuses and the government records, however, as has become commonplace, especially in Métis politics, the effects of that as we start to also see ourselves as racialized. And Chris Anderson, of course, talks about this ad nauseum in his book, right? That, colonialism, we also start to identify that, and that causes us misrecognizing ourselves. So I think, this is where you see it happen in really silly ways where the MNO creates their Great Lakes Métis group, and the sort of like grandfathering of like poly communities and stuff based on racialized notions of Métis communities, right? So yeah, I think they start to live in us, and it starts to we start to become part of that governing.
Thank you. Our next question is from RLA Hancock, who asks, can you please say a bit about how you choose the metaphors you use, such as intelligibility, legibility, and illumination?
Okay, I don't remember using the word illuminate, but in terms of legibility, I think, you know, it's like with governmentality, at least, you know, so much of it is about you have to be able to know something in order to in part in order to govern it and manage it. So that's where I found the identification process as a really important process for governing, and it definitely, like, you see it with the growth of certain state apparatuses. And in the dissertation, I only really look at the municipality. Well, I look at the municipality and the province, and especially I look actually in the role of anthropologists in Manitoba, who are invested in action anthropology to actually identify Métis as a racial population within within Manitoba, which is through the Lagacé report, which I didn't cover today, but I cover at length in the dissertation. And then, of course, it also happens through the Prairie Farm Rehabilitation Commission and the Agricultural Development Act as well.
Next question is from Kai, who says, I'm wondering if you can say a bit about how this history of 20th century Métis land loss alters the overall narratives that are told about the Métis and land. And he also says, thank you for your presentation.
Thanks, Kai. That's very nice of you. Yeah, I think it is kind of it definitely goes against the grain, in my opinion, because the overwhelming history is that we lose all of our land, and that we all move to Saskatchewan, and that's just, it's simply and as far as I can understand through reading the historiography of it, like, this is definitely the thesis that Sprague advances, and then it gets tied up with the Sprague-Flanagan debates. And you know, the thing is a future research project that I have is actually taking the report that was used by Jean Lagacé, or that Jean Lagacé reported on, where it identified 254 Métis communities in Manitoba in 1959. And I want to work backwards from those communities and then back towards the census records, and look at the stuff that Frank Tuff and the MNC has been doing to sort of match them up so that we can get a better, so that we can kind of fill in that black hole of history that we have. Because so much of that narrative of these the problem with the 20th century is it's such a black hole, in the sense that we don't know as much about it as we do the 19th century, because historians have had such tunnel vision on that one particular moment. But so it's going to take a lot of elbow grease and a lot of work, and I'm really excited to do more of that work.
Okay, and we have a question from Wyatt, who says, I totally agree with the practicality of buying land for some semblance of land back, but I'm also conscious that this practice could harm our relationships with local First Nations. How might we be able to balance the need for a land base while also building good relationships with other Indigenous peoples? Not to paint this question as my own necessarily, but was asked by someone I have a lot of respect for, and think that it's an important question.
Right. So I think that given the lack of recognition of Métis by the Crown in terms of land, and that we're not within the administration of the Indian Act, obviously being outside of that whole entire apparatus, which is really the apparatus that distributes Indigenous land, other than Métis settlements in the province, but that's a provincial that's a provincial relationship, right? I just don't. I think there's enough space for all of us. You know, like it's not like us buying up farmers' land, especially in like. So the other thing is like, for me with like Monkman Point is like the place where my family's from, and that we have our Indigenous relationality too. So in terms of like who's going to necessarily like have a beef with that, so to speak, I don't know. But also to some point, right, like it's not like Métis are going out and you know, it's not like you know, it's a huge conflict, of course, because for instance, in Winnipeg, there's a current feud between local First Nations and the MMF over the Capian barracks. However, at the end of the day, if as long as those lands are going to an Indigenous people that will provide resources for the growth of for Indigenous sovereignty, I'm more interested in that pragmatic move than necessarily necessarily backing off and saying that we need to have all of our ducks in a row to begin with. I think that in a place where land truly matters, like on the prairies, that and when you're living in your own homeland, I think that that changes a little bit.
Thank you very much, David. So now we're going to move into our next and final speaker, Chelsea Vowel. Chelsea is Métis from Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Lac Centre in Alberta. She has a BA Ed, an LLB, and an MA, and is a Cree language instructor in the Faculty of Native Studies at the University of Alberta. Chelsea is a public intellectual, writer, and educator whose work intersects language, gender, Métis self-determination, and resurgence. She is a co-host with Molly Swain of the feminist sci-fi podcast Métis in Space. And as we just heard from David, co-founded the Métis in Spaceland Trust. So Chelsea, your turn. Thanks.
We're like the same person. All right, let's see here. This is like every time I teach the class too, I have to figure out how to share my screen again. Okay. And okay, so are you seeing the full screen, or are you just seeing the little one? Is it the whole screen? Thanks so much. You never know. All right. Okay, I just want to point out this amazing Red River carp. All right, so my thesis, I defended it back in January, so it's been a while, but it's sort of a continuation of the work that I'm constantly doing anyway. So the name of my thesis is Where No Mischief Has Gone Before, the Form and Function of Métis Futurisms. And of course, that was Molly who came up with that title because she's really good at naming things, and I'm not. All right, so first, Tanse Chelsea Vowel Nitsigason Mantu Sakaigenik Nitotsin, Maga Niwiginuta Amasquatsi Waskaigenik Kanot, Segwa Nigotwasik Nitotansin. So, Otpem Suasquewak Umania. I'm a Métis woman from Lac St. Anne living here in Edmonton. I have 6 daughters. I bring this up all the time so that you understand why if I stop making sense and I just pass out in my seat, it's because I'm constantly exhausted. All right, so Kiga Atimosta Maui Itanawao. So I'm going to tell you a little story because that's really what my thesis was about. All right, so first off, I want to talk a little bit about my methodology. Just a foreground, I'm not going to tell you what I did yet or what conclusions I came up to, just how I started doing it, because figuring that out first was really important to actually the whole process. So I wanted to use this term in Cree, Ekweskimoyak. So that means all of us, we are all transforming. Okay, what does that mean? So within my thesis, I was trying to sort of assert and work within an Otpemso Itapisinwin, which is that's a Métis worldview, right? And I actually use Métis worldviews. I discussed the difference between a Métis worldview and Métis worldviews, because the Métis Nation spans an incredible geographic, distance. There are a variety of kinscapes that we exist within, and so in some areas we are closer to the Nehiawak, the Cree, and in other areas Métis are closer to Anishinaabe, and in other areas Métis are just like they're really themselves, without a lot of deep kinships with the First Nations around them. So there's a lot of different worldviews, and I really wanted to resist sort of asserting any sort of homogeneity among Métis. We're incredibly varied, even with our own nation. So all the work that I do, I try to really position myself as specifically Métis from Lac Saint Anne, Mantusaqaigan. And so I can't speak for all Métis. I don't even speak for all Métis that are from Lac Saint Anne, right? It's just one particular experience. All right. You can't see it, but I'm just moving your heads over because your heads are in the way. All right. So within a Métis and Nehiyaw worldview, so transformation is a fact of life. It's constant. It's embedded in the Cree language. When we talk about colors in Cree, those are verbs. They're not adjectives. So we might say wapskal anatatabun, so or umatatabun. So this chair is being white. Okay, and the idea that it could change colors is sort of like embedded in the language itself. Transformation is constant. It's not remarkable. It exists as a foundational knowledge within Métis and Nehiyaw metaphysics. And it's really important to foreground that, because it tells us that we can actually also engage in transformation and spark transformation in a variety of ways. So words and stories in Métis and Nehiyaw worldview are very powerful, not just because they might move people or maybe it entertains, but rather because they can cause transformation to occur, good, bad, like a variety of different kinds of transformation. So we're told to be careful with our words, because what we put out there sort of expands and reverberates beyond maybe our intentions or our control. And now that the snow is on the ground, there are stories and words that we can use that we can't use when it's in the summer or the spring or the snow is not on the ground. So the methodologies that I use to engage in Métis Futurisms are autoethnography, first off. So this is the idea of telling one's own story. But in this context, I'm not interested in, navel gazing and being like, what about myself? So much as I am interested in the story of my community, specifically Mantusaqaigan, but not just Mantusaqaigan, because Mantusaqaigan exists within wider kinscape. So we have relationships with St. Albert, we have relationships with the Red River communities, we have relationships with First Nations in the North, First Nations that are literally like living side by side with us. There are all sorts of things going on that Métis from Lac Saint Anne have engaged in. Slave Lake. When you look at the research, you see that Métis from Lac Saint Anne traveled all over the place, just like Indigenous people traveled all over the place and continue to do so. So that's what my main focus is I want to tell the story of my community in a variety of different ways. So in order to do this, I engaged in research for creation, which is described as like the initial gathering together of materials, ideas, concepts, collaborators, technology, in order to begin. So in order to sit down and write or produce Métis Futurisms, because Métis Futurisms, I'll get into that a bit later, but it doesn't just include stories, it includes like a variety of material culture and all sorts of productions. But in order to do it, first, there's the research, there's the question, there's the what if, and then you have to go back into the historical record. You got to talk to people, and until you do that work, you cannot really begin to start writing the story. It's not coming just from your own brain, it's coming from the history and the lived reality of your own community. So kinscapes, I keep using this term, but it's coined by Brenda McDougall, and she defines it as a network of family relationships knit together in a certain place and time. And I wanted to also identify the fact that this does not only include human kin, right? We have that network of family and kinship relationships with our non-human kin as well. So kinscapes are governed, they're constituted by Wakutuin, which is a concept of expanded kinship. And it's not just like, the Fast and Furious franchise family. Like Wakutuin is like a foundational law. It's how we relate to one another. And there are very specific roles that we have to one another. And those roles are not rights-based, they're based on reciprocal obligation. What do we owe to one another? And also it's really, really important whenever we talk about Wakutuin, whenever we talk about kinship, don't romanticize it. Think about your own families. Think about how you don't get along sometimes. There might be some relatives you can't stand and who can't stand you, but they're still your relations. And you still have to relate to them somehow. So again, often when people talk about kinship, I find that they think it's this harmonious, wonderful, peaceful thing, but families never like that. Families never just purely harmonious. There's always going to be conflict. And what Wakutuin teaches us is how we resolve that conflict between our human kin, our non-human kin. All right. So I also want to push back against the very ahistoric colonial imperative to define Métis peoples as distinct and apart from First Nations, because the fact is particularly in this area, if you were to really try to separate us and cut us apart and say you're just this or you're just that, it would be all but impossible. Because of the specific history out here, Métis and Cree and also Nakota, were shoved together in different bands that were disbanded and later came back together. Some people took script, some people took treaty from the same families. So I identify as Métis because all of my ancestors are Métis, right? But some of them at some point were also potentially Cree. I just don't identify myself as Cree because I come from, my understanding of myself and my community is purely Métis. I can't speak for the Cree, but we do have like very deep and long relationships, and sort of creating those divisions between us so that we can be more legible to the Canadian state, because that's what the Canadian state wants us to do. This is us, we're in a box, there's the Cree in a box, there's the Nakota in a box, is how they administer us. And it's really important to push back against that. So I really want to, shout out Rob Innes for doing that, Tasha Beads, there's Paul Sisquasis is fantastic for this. So people who sort of like really look back at the history and explain all the ways that we are interwoven, I think help us think about how we can continue to be interwoven in the future, not work at odds with one another, which is what I think a lot of our political entities encourage, because money and power. So Tasha Beads, who is both Nehiyaw and Barbadian, notes that in her area, Métis and Nehiyawa have fluid kinship lines and a shared worldview. So in some of the work that she's done, she always hyphenates. She says Nehiyaw Métis, Nehiyaw/Métis, and she talks about things from that perspective, that shared perspective. So in my thesis, I just flipped it a little bit. I was like, I'm going to foreground Métis because I'm Métis. So I go Métis, Nehiyaw, or Nehiyawa all the time. All right. So what the heck am I even talking about? What do I do? So Métis Futurisms. Kigwa, what is that? All right. So I find that Métis Futurisms engage in what Scott Lyons calls rhetorical sovereignty. So it's the inherent right and ability of peoples to determine their own communicative needs and desires. That's a really fancy way to say we just want to tell our stories our own way. So we can tell those stories in a variety of ways. We can tell actual stories. We can make material culture. We can do all sorts of kinds of art. You know, it's in the way we dress. It's in the music that we produce. It's in everything that Métis people do to express our culture and assert a worldview and tell the stories the way we want to tell them. And sometimes when we tell those stories, they're misrecognized because they don't fit into the sort of things that people expect from Métis. Well, you know, you bead, so I want to see some beading. Wait, you're doing digital beading? What even is that? That's not authentic, right? So this idea of authenticity is often a cage that we're put in to you know, sort of limit what we're able to accomplish. And I think that Futurisms busts through that in a really fantastic way. So Indigenous Futurisms, of which Métis Futurisms is simply one subset. Okay, so I envision Indigenous Futurisms contain within them so many different types of Futurisms. You know, Inuit Futurisms, Dene Futurisms, like, you know, these are stories told in the way that they want to tell them from a particular point of view. And we're not all going to tell those stories the same. So those Indigenous Futurisms, as Grace Dillon, who coined the term, sort of like, you know, with a lot of harkening back to Afrofuturisms, and Indigenous Futurisms are greatly indebted to the groundbreaking work that Afrofuturisms have done. She says that, you know, doing this work involves discovering how personally one is affected by colonization, right? It's not just, you know, sort of letting your imagination run wild. It's thinking about how has colonization impacted us? How has it changed things? How do we alter that? How can we move past it? How can we do otherwise? So Métis Futurisms, I've actually had people ask this. Indigenous Futurisms, so anybody can do that, right? It's just talking about Native stuff. Moya, Métis Futurisms and Indigenous Futurisms, I think, like I assert, that they can only be done by us. They can, you know, if we're doing Métis Futurisms, then it's got to be by Métis people who are asserting Métis Otpemsu Etap Sinwin, Métis worldview, okay, in the past, present, and the future. So Futurisms, it sounds like it's all forward looking, but really we can reimagine the past. We can think differently about the future, and we can think into the present. We can think differently about the future. And if we have other people doing that, you know, they're sort of, what we've seen is when people want to write us, they're writing us from the kind of the imaginary that exists in their mind of us. And it's not necessarily authentic. So I think that I think it's fine for us to carve out a space and say, this is just for us to do, because it has a purpose beyond just creating art or stories. It has well, let me get into what that purpose is. All right, so the purpose of Métis Futurisms is to imagine otherwise. So where can imagination take us? All right, so maybe it takes us here. This is a splash page from a graphic novel chapter that I did for This Place Retold 150 Years. It's the final chapter in a series of chapters that sort of cover, again, 150 years of Canadian history from an Indigenous perspective. And so my chapter is focused in the future. We've got some time travel, we've got all this stuff going on. So when I was working with the artist Tara Audibert, I had to explain what I wanted to see because I'm no artist. And she brought this to life. And I said, you know, the idea that Indigenous peoples cannot coexist with technology is totally ridiculous. And again, ahistoric. Like, Indigenous peoples have always been fantastic at integrating new technologies and using them according to our worldviews in ways that actually make sense to us. So if in the future we see something like this, where we have a futuristic, sustainable city, because cities, you know, the idea that like we would just go, you know, decolonization happens, we're all back in the Stone Age and there's no technology, you know, even though obviously technologies existed in the Stone Age too, is ridiculous. That's not what we're about, right? So the idea of this like sustainable, futuristic city, and this backdrop of some traditional, you know, you've got your teepees and they're facing the wrong way, but whatever, geodesic domes, and you know, a traditional sort of gathering where people are coming together to decide communal affairs, right? Why can't this happen? It's happening now. Why wouldn't this happen into the future? So what I did then is I created a series of short stories, and I theorized about them. So I'm, the research as creation, I was sitting there researching, I'd have an idea. I'm like, what if a Métis superhero existed? What would that look like? And then I had to do a bunch of research about the time frame that I was putting the story into, and what were the living conditions for Métis at that time, etc. So these short stories that I created, to me, they're a roadmap. They have us question what has happened and what can happen, and we think about where do we want to be. If everything was perfect, if we got everything we needed, all of the resources, all of the power, what would that ideal future look like for us? And I find that in mainstream science fiction, people are able to do that. Nobody questions them and says, what's the 121 step program to getting to, the 24th century, and you're flying around on spaceships and you're part of this federation. Like, nobody's like, there's fan fiction that fills it in, and there's all sorts of stuff that fills it in, but nobody's like demanding that they do it before they just have the adventures in space. Well, let us have the adventures in space, and don't expect us to tell you exactly how it's going to happen. Ditto with decolonization. If we think about where we could be, then we can start acting otherwise and making it real. So the first story that I wrote is Buffalo Bird. It's a historical fiction. It's set in the mid-19th century. And the idea is that the Nehiyapoat, or the Iron Confederacy, successfully prevents Canadian expansion into the West. So they never colonize the prairies, and they don't genocide the Pasquale Mostoswak, the buffalo. So our kinscapes remain intact, our landscapes remain intact, and we're thriving. So what would that mean for us today? If the buffalo were thriving, if we were in deep relationship with the land and with other Indigenous nations again, and we had this diplomatic ability with power to negotiate with the Canadian state as equals, where would we be today, right? And so in thinking about that, we can think about the present right now and say, well, if that had happened, here's where we'll be, and we can start behaving in that way. And in fact, the Pasquale Mostoswak are being rematriated. There are multiple nations who are working together to bring buffalo back to these lands. And imagine what that is going to do. How is that going to? It changes the physical landscape. It changes the spiritual landscape. It has the potential to transform everything. So in reimagining the past, where I get to do things like have a main character who's a Rougarou and turns into a black stallion who tramples John A. Macdonald to death, there's a little bit of like, I can have some fun with it. I can engage in a little bit of like revenge fantasy. But really what it does is it lets us think about what if, and what can we do now to make it good for us. The second story I wrote was Mischief Man. That was set in the mid-20th century. And again, it was like, what would a Métis superhero look like? So in this story, Mischief Man has incredible strength, which is a typical superpower thing, but also nobody who is not related to him can remember him. So he can never become famous. He can never become, that person that they put up on a pedestal where everybody's like, wow, Mischief Man, you're so cool. Nah, nobody remembers him. They don't even know what he does, right? So he can't get this big head. And it's this idea of being humble. Humility is is a really important concept and idea in Métis and Nehiyaw worldviews. So this sort of forces him to act in a way where Wakutuin is his guiding principle rather than that need for fame or saviorism or anything. So thinking about that means, again, for ourselves, how can we behave in ways now where we ensure that the work that we're doing is beneficial to our entire community and not just ourselves? All right, Dirty Wings is the third story, and this is a dreaming story. So the idea of dreaming stories is also really important. It's a specific genre within our storytelling traditions, and this one sort of just asserts Métis metaphysics in the now, in the hazy now. So if we were not so cut off from the spiritual realm as many of us feel like we are right now, if those connections were deeper and stronger and more present, what might our present be like as Métis peoples walking around just asserting these, asserting Wakuto and asserting the idea that transformation is fundamental and constant, asserting that when we say we have deep relationships, that we are actually engaging those deep relationships. And then the final story, Aneskotsigan, is which means a string of beads. This is a near future story. It challenges again the notion of Métis as anti-technology, because what they do is they use nanite technology to embed translators in utero, so that when these children, these Métis and Cree children are born, they can only hear Cree. And, you know, because we're, especially as a language instructor and somebody who's been devoted to, you know, the Cree language for so long, the fact that we continue to experience decline in our languages is really disturbing. And often technology is touted as the savior. It's going to save us. And, you know, sometimes it's just not doing it's not doing the job. Apps are not going to do the job. We need to speak the language, and we need to hear the language all the time. So what if we use technology for that? You know, how can we continue to adapt technology to fit within our worldviews? So we imagine otherwise so we can act otherwise. All right, and this is, so that story that I talked about with the nanites has 3 versions. One is a very short hint version, a slightly longer like flash fiction, and then the short story itself, and this is the hint version. So it's the ancestors spoke. We didn't understand. They spoke again. This time the nanites ensure our comprehension. So it gives you just like a slight hint of what the story is about. And I put this picture in here because this is also from the graphic novel chapter that I worked on. And the time travel technology that Wabanatsagos, the main character, uses is actually a shaking tent. You know, it is a sacred ceremony wherein we are able to communicate with people at a distance, communicate with the spirit world. Why wouldn't we model time travel technology after something that we use in our own culture, right? So this idea, like steampunk comes from a particular, you know, view, a cultural view. Let's think about what our science looks like and will continue to look like. So all of this leads to acting otherwise. When we envision the future we want to see for ourselves, we give ourselves space to make that future real. And here's a picture of the land that is now part of the Métis and Space Land Trust that we are holding for future generations. You know, and what we plan to do with this is very much based in that imagining otherwise, in having good relationships based on Wokotuin, working things slow, thinking way past our own generation to what this land could mean for all of our peoples, all Indigenous peoples in the areas, as well as non-Indigenous peoples in the areas. So hi, can I ask you that's it.
Thank you very much, Chelsea, for this really engaging presentation and for talking about the future. So do we have any questions for Chelsea?
First question that's come up is, where can we read these short stories?
Yeah, so my thesis is available. You can just go Chelsea Vowel thesis, MA thesis, and you'll find it. Yeah, it's available online.
We're going to try to put all the work that you guys have done, like your thesis, on our website, so then people can have access. Are you going to publish those stories?
Yeah, I am actually. So I have a contract with Arsenal Press to write a couple more stories. I keep adding more. It was supposed to be 4 more stories, and now it's like 6. And put it into a book that's going to be called Buffalo is the New Buffalo. So it's going to be, there's so many great stories. I can't wait. Yes, I'm just going to keep writing short story, science fiction. It's the best.
I think that's a great idea. You should, keep writing. Next question is for Kimberly. Do you think your short stories are feasible for sharing as a K-12 classroom resource?
Yeah, definitely. There's like, I'm just thinking to all of them. There's nothing like terribly advanced about them or anything. Some of them are some of them are longer than others. Buffalo Bird is almost like a novella, but the other ones are quite short. And I know that some people are already using them that way. And I've had a few. It's very interesting because I've had some people use some of the stories in the classroom and then tell me their interpretations, and I'm just like, wow. Because when you write something and when you produce any sort of, material culture as well, you have your idea, you put it out in the world, but how people react to it and how they interpret it also becomes true. So it's like you're in this dialogue with people, not necessarily in the same room, but they're reacting to the work that you produce, and what they come up with because of it might be something you never imagined. So it's this strange sort of delayed collaborative experience that exists within all material culture production.
Great, wonderful. Any other questions?
Maybe from the other speakers too?
Sure,
Cool.
David, Molly, anybody?
I'm good. I love this.
Yeah, feel free to turn on your video and
What are you
ask.
planning to do on the land that you have, Chelsea?
Just when I thought I was out, you pulled me back in. Yeah, so COVID obviously slowed everything down. So right now we need to focus on getting some infrastructure. There's no access to the land from the road. We need to have a well. We need to sort of put things in place so that we can start bringing materials out there to do anything. But really, like, the main focus of this is on relationship building with groups who are doing work already. We don't want to keep replicating or, work that is already being done. So we want to work with people that we have good relationships with, that we've developed good relationships with, to come out and support them in the work that they do. And and we're not there yet at all. Like I said, like, until we can't even get onto the land. So you have to remember with these kinds of projects, like, we need to think beyond our own lifespan for this. Like, this, whatever work we do there is going to be carried on by people in future generations. So it's okay to build slowly, and it's okay to build thoughtfully. And that relationship building that I keep talking about is strenuous. It requires a lot of work, and it's going to take time. So I need everybody to understand that when you're doing that kind of work, take time, and it's okay. We can't be rushing into it.
Thank you very much. So I'd like to thank you all the presenters, for an amazing panel, very engaging, fantastic presentations. And I would like also to take the time to thank Nancy Van Stuyvendale for being open to have such a panel, an RCMR research panel that we labeled. I'd like also to thank Devin Drossel, that we haven't seen, but who supported, she supported the chat, and she provided the discussion questions to Amanda. And I, of course, would like to thank Amanda Evans for all the work she's done. Like, I always say that she's our technology guru, for everything, the technical support, and also for taking the time to ask the questions. So really, thank you all, and we shall do it again. Thanks. And I'll pass the baton to Nancy for closing remarks.
Yes, thank you, Natalie, and thank you to all the presenters for just a fabulous session today. Thank you to all of the audience members for coming and supporting this session, as well as our previous two sessions. I've put in the chat the link to our Faculty of Native Studies research accomplishments for the year. Devin had posted that earlier, and then I just reposted it again. So you can take a look. That links to our website and shows all of the amazing presentations, publications, projects, etc., that faculty members and graduate students in our faculty have been up to over the past year. And just quickly before we leave, I would be remiss if I didn't thank everyone who has been involved in the entire research series, people behind the scenes. Janet Delorme, Jordan Cook, and Amanda Evans have all been instrumental, the core team that helped make the whole series possible. So thank you very much for all of your help and support. And I would also like to thank AF, one of our graduate students who helped designing the research posters that you can check out at the link that I posted. So thank you everyone for this very successful annual event. Check out our research accomplishments, and we look forward to seeing you again next year. We do this every year. Hopefully we'll get to meet in person next year, but this was a nice alternative and a good opportunity to share our research with you. So thank you for coming, and have a great day.